There are moments inside the British monarchy that never make it into the official record. No press release is issued. No palace spokesman drafts a careful statement. No spokesperson steps in front of a camera and delivers a measured version of events for the evening news. These are the moments that travel a different way entirely, through whispered phone calls, through the tight circle of people who were present and cannot quite believe what they witnessed, through the kind of silence that descends over a room when something irreversible has just happened and everyone in it knows it. What unfolded on a rain-soaked evening at one of Britain's most storied royal estates was precisely that kind of moment. And the ripple it sent through the House of Windsor, through the careful geometry of power that holds that family together, had not fully settled by the time the sun rose the following morning. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Tom Parker Bowles actually is in the context of this institution. Not who he is by blood, not who he is in the public imagination as Queen Camilla's charming, food-writing son who makes regular appearances at literary events and cigar dinners and charity galas, but who he has allowed himself to become in the spaces where the cameras do not follow. Tom Parker Bowles is 51 years old. He is a respected food critic and writer. He has built a genuine career in those fields on his own terms, and that should be acknowledged. He writes with real authority about food. His books are well received. His column in the Mail on Sunday carries weight in the culinary world. None of that is in dispute. But there is another version of Tom Parker Bowles that exists in the corridors adjacent to royal life, the version that understands, with the precision of someone who has watched carefully for 2 decades, exactly how much a mother's position can extend outward to protect a son who never held a royal title, never took a royal oath, and never accepted the responsibilities that come with royal proximity. That version of Tom Parker Bowles had been operating in those corridors for years. And on this particular evening he pushed that understanding one step too far. The estate in question, one of the great working properties held under the constitutional stewardship of the Prince of Wales, had been the subject of a growing concern inside William's office for some time. The Duchy of Cornwall, that ancient institution created by Edward III in 1337 specifically to provide an income for the heir to the throne, is not simply a collection of land and property. It is a living constitutional arrangement. It represents the legal and historic bridge between the present and the future of the monarchy itself. Every acre of it, every building on it, every penny generated by it flows through a framework of obligation that has survived wars, abdications, and the complete restructuring of what the British Crown means in a modern world. Prince William, as Duke of Cornwall, holds that stewardship not as a privilege but as a duty. And when that duty was being quietly undermined by someone leveraging the Queen Consort's name to gain access to land and hospitality that was never his to distribute, it became not merely a family annoyance. It became a constitutional matter. The intelligence that had reached William's desk over the preceding months was damaging. There had been events, private, corporate, undisclosed to the relevant estate management, where guests arrived on duchy grounds under the impression that they were there with some form of royal endorsement. There had been instances where Tom's name had been used to open doors that had no business opening for him. And there had been, most troublingly, a pattern. Not a single incident that could be dismissed as overreach or misunderstanding. A pattern. One that suggested a deliberate calculation about how much room existed between what was permitted and what could be gotten away with before someone official pushed back. William's response was measured in the way that William's responses tend to be. He did not act in heat. He does not tend to. He commissioned a full and thorough audit of the duchy's records. He asked the right questions through the right channels. He waited for the picture to become complete. And when it did, what he saw confirmed everything the early intelligence had suggested, and then exceeded it. The financial losses were real. The damage to heritage properties on the estate was real. The casual circumvention of security protocols that protected sovereign land from unvetted access was real. Every piece of it landed on William's desk in black and white, with the kind of documentation that does not allow for comfortable alternative interpretations. The decision William made next said something important about who he is as a future king. He did not act impulsively. He did not storm into the situation himself and create the loudest possible royal confrontation. He was, at that moment, deeply engaged in private and sensitive conversations with King Charles about the long-term future of the Crown estate, conversations built on trust, on mutual respect, and on the fragile and carefully constructed understanding between a reigning monarch and the son who will one day succeed him. Had William inserted himself directly and publicly into a confrontation with Camilla's son, those conversations would have been poisoned. The headlines would have swallowed everything. The work of months would have been undone by an evening. So he called his uncle instead. Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, is a man who has spent the better part of 3 decades being systematically underestimated. He is the youngest of King Charles's siblings. He was the one who tried his hand at television production in the 1990s and had those years used against him as evidence that he lacked the gravity the family required. He is not the one people think of first when they picture the royal family's firepower. That perhaps is precisely why William trusted him with this. Because the person standing in that room with full legal authority, who nobody had been watching, who nobody had been trying to neutralize in advance, was going to have the element of complete surprise on his side. And on this night, surprise was a significant strategic advantage. William did not send Edward in without armor. He transferred to him, formally and completely, his full administrative authority over the duchy for the purposes of this specific situation. Every legal right William held as Duke of Cornwall. The power to act decisively without delay, without the need to call back for approval. He placed the entire constitutional weight of the Prince of Wales behind his uncle's every step. Edward accepted it and he did not hesitate. He arrived at the estate that evening in the kind of rain that makes England feel very old and very serious. Inside the main hall of the property, a different atmosphere prevailed. It was warm with candlelight. There were well-dressed guests with wine in their hands, the kind of people who measure their own importance by the rooms they gain access to. There was catering clearly brought in from outside. There was equipment, generators, refrigeration units, industrial warming trays, plugged into the estate's own power supply. And there was a crest mounted on the wall. It was not the royal crest. But it was close enough to the royal crest that a casual eye might not notice the difference immediately, and a careful eye would feel something wrong before it could name exactly what. Tom Parker Bowles was in the center of all of it, moving through the room with the ease of someone who believed, with genuine confidence, that this space belonged to him tonight. He had the air of a host. He had the body language of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. He was laughing with investors. He was working the room with the smooth efficiency of someone who understood that the value of what he was selling was access, and that access, when delivered with enough confidence and the right backdrop, can seem very real indeed. He noticed Edward at roughly the same moment the room did. The thing about Edward's entrance that nobody who was present that night would forget was its complete absence of drama. He did not stride in with the theatrical force of someone arriving to make a point. He walked in, steadily, his coat still wet from the rain. He stopped near the entrance and simply stood there, taking in the room. The temperature in that hall dropped several degrees in the space of about 4 seconds. Tom's instinct, and it was by all accounts a revealing instinct, was to take the offensive. He crossed the floor toward Edward with his chin raised and his voice pitched to carry, and he told Edward that he had no right to be here, that the event was proceeding under proper authority, that everything was entirely in order. He said it confidently, the way a man says something he needs the room to believe even as doubt begins its quiet work beneath the surface. Edward said nothing. That silence, those few seconds in which Edward simply looked at Tom and offered him nothing to work with, unsettled Tom in a way that all the words in the world could not have done. Tom had prepared for an argument. He had prepared for a confrontation he believed he could win on the strength of his mother's position. He had not prepared for a man who simply had nothing to prove and no interest in the performance Tom was offering him. What came next was an unraveling of the kind that happens when someone has been protected from consequences for long enough that they have genuinely lost the ability to read danger accurately. Tom began to speak about Edward's relevance. He spoke about generations and about what real power looked like in a modern world. He said things in front of a room full of London's most connected people that he should never have said anywhere near witnesses, let alone in front of witnesses of this caliber. He was telling himself a story he had been told so many times, protected so consistently, that he had begun to believe it was simply true. That being Camilla's son made him a permanent exception to every rule everyone else had to follow. Edward waited. Then he spoke, quietly enough that the people at the edges of the room leaned slightly forward to catch it. He did not raise his voice once. He did not match Tom's energy. He simply stated what was true. This land belonged to the Prince of Wales. The authority under which this evening was being conducted did not exist. Camilla's name, however it had been invoked, carried no legal weight on this ground. And Tom Parker Bowles had 60 minutes to remove every person he had brought onto this property and every piece of equipment his operation had connected to the estate's power supply. Anyone remaining on the property when that hour was up would be removed and charged with criminal trespass on sovereign land. Then he turned and nodded to the men who had come in with him and had been moving quietly through the back of the room during the entire exchange. The lights in the kitchen died. The catering equipment went dark. Men in estate livery began the systematic disconnection and removal of everything Tom had brought in. The crest on the wall, that careful almost but not quite copy of something it was never authorized to be, was taken down and carried out. And the guests, all of them, people who had paid or been promised to be here, people who had built their attendance on the understanding that proximity to royalty was on offer tonight, sat exactly where they were and did not move and did not speak above a murmur. Tom's phone was in his hand within seconds. He turned away from the room and made the call, and within 2 minutes, a voice was coming through on the other end that everyone in the room recognized even through a phone speaker: Queen Camilla. Furious, immediate and clear. She ordered the intervention to stop. She used the language of authority. She said she would take this directly to the king. She said this was a private family matter and heavy-handed intervention of this kind was neither necessary nor welcome. Edward's aide held out the phone to him. Edward took it. He listened to Camilla long enough to hear the shape of what she was saying. Then while she was still speaking he ended the call. The room absorbed that in complete silence. Every person in that hall had just watched the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom be cut off in the middle of a sentence. Not by a political rival. Not by a journalist. By the youngest brother of the king, who had said nothing in response to her, who had given her no argument to defeat and no demand to refuse. He had simply taken the phone from his aide, listened and pressed the button. Then he handed the phone back and returned his attention to the operation in progress. Tom understood in that moment that there was no rescue coming. The calculation he had built his entire way of operating on, that Camilla's name was a shield that would hold under any pressure in any situation before any audience, had just failed in front of some of the most socially powerful people in London. He did not go quietly. That would have required a kind of self-possession he did not have access to in that moment. He was escorted toward the exit with his voice rising, making claims and issuing threats that the room heard in full. He said things about members of the royal family, by name in front of witnesses who would remember every word and would not keep it to themselves, that crossed lines that cannot easily be walked back across. The door closed on him. The room remained. And in that room, there was not a single person who had moved to help him or speak in his defense. Camilla called back. Edward did not take the second call. When she reached him a third time, he had already left the estate and was en route to deliver his report to William's office. He sent word through a member of his staff that the matter had been resolved and that she would receive full documentation of the evening's events through the appropriate formal channels in due course. What happened in the hours and days that followed matters as much as what happened in that hall, because this is where the true weight of the evening settled into the longer story of what the monarchy is becoming under William's influence. Camilla, by the morning after, had tried several approaches. She had attempted to reach William directly. Those calls were met with calm, measured responses from William's staff. There was no hostility. There was no drama. There was simply the immovable fact that what had occurred under proper legal authority, that the audit results existed and were documented, that the people who had witnessed the evening were under no obligation of confidentiality, and that whatever Camilla chose to do next would happen in full view of a situation that was already resolved. The formal complaint she had threatened to raise, the one where she would challenge Edward's standing to act, never materialized in writing. Because to put that challenge on the record in writing, she would have had to argue formally that her authority as Queen Consort superseded William's constitutional authority over the Duchy of Cornwall as Duke of Cornwall and heir apparent. And there is no legal or constitutional framework anywhere in the United Kingdom under which that argument holds. The lawyers she would have needed to make that case would have told her the same thing. The argument collapses before the first sentence is finished. For those who had watched Camilla's position in the royal family harden over many years into something that looked, from the outside, like genuine institutional authority, the careful rehabilitation of her public image, the steady accumulation of royal duties, the impressive way she has grown into the ceremonial demands of her role, the events of this evening asked a difficult question. How much of that authority was load-bearing? How much of it could stand independently of Charles's presence, his protection, his willingness to ensure the space around her was always managed in her favor? The answer that emerged from one wet evening at a royal estate was not the answer Camilla would have chosen. Because the moment her power was tested on ground where it had no legal standing, ground where the constitutional reality of succession placed a different authority entirely, it did not hold. She had moved fast. She had brought everything she had to bear on a situation that had already been decided before she made the first call. And what she was left with was the sound of a disconnected line and a room full of people who had heard every word. Edward will carry this with him. He has spent his life watching this institution make accommodations it should not have made, bend rules it should not have bent, look away from things it should have addressed because the alternative, the confrontation, the disruption, the possibility of destabilizing something that everyone was invested in keeping stable, always seemed like too high a price to pay. What William gave him that night was not just administrative authority over a duchy. It was the instruction that the price of looking away had finally become higher than the price of acting. As for the longer arc of this story, the audit that William now holds, the documentation of what had been happening on duchy properties over years, the formal record of guests and transactions and events that should never have occurred, that work is not finished. It is patient work, the kind that William has always been better at than his opponents expect. He does not move before he is ready. He does not create spectacle when documentation will serve the same purpose more permanently. And he now has everything he needs. The monarchy has always been a long game. The people who have tried to exploit the spaces within it by betting that no one would ever move against them have, historically, been wrong in the same way. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But irreversibly. Tom Parker Bowles built his access on a borrowed foundation. The foundation was called in. And the name above the door that he thought guaranteed him entry into every room turned out to be exactly as limited as everyone outside the family had always known it to be.